We're just going to give folks a few seconds to join us, and then we'll get started. Let's give it a few more seconds, and we'll get going. Okay, we'll get started. Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us it's going to be a very informative hour. I want to thank our series sponsor, the Job Gym. They've been a great partner to us over the years for all of our employment and training needs. I'd like to introduce Lulu Antonocci. And sorry, you're going to have to tell me your
That's
last
okay.
name. I've gotten it wrong. She is a work path employment counselor. Lulu, take it away. Screen is
Yeah.
yours.
Thank you, Dolores. It is tough. It's Italian. It's Antonucci, but you
I'm
were
usually
almost
good
there.
with Italian names. It just wouldn't
That's
roll off the tongue today.
that's okay. I'm happy to join today's Lunch and Learn, and us at the Job Gym, we're very glad to sponsor this event. I've had the pleasure to work with Aileen and her team at the John Howard Society of Ontario to educate myself on the myths and stereotypes surrounding justice-involved workers. And myself, I've had the unique opportunity over the last 6 months to lead the Work Path program. This is an initiative specific to connecting justice-involved job seekers to employers within the manufacturing and hospitality industries. And through this experience, I've come across several hardworking and loyal candidates who are looking for that opportunity to improve their lives for the better and contribute to our labor market in a positive way. Um, a statistic that's actually super interesting is 1 in 9 Canadians have a criminal record, and that is a huge untapped pool of candidates that can help bridge the gap in Niagara's workforce. But to say, I'm very excited to hear more from Aileen and look forward to today's session. So thank you, Dolores.
Great. Thank you, Lulu. So today we welcome Eileen Simon. Eileen is the Education and Strategic Initiatives Coordinator at the John Howard Society. She works to translate the center's research and policy work into engaging and interactive educational materials, tools, and content. She's been the lead on creating, designing, and publishing educational tools and content for employers, HR managers, and frontline staff on justice-involved job seekers, gaining insights into the practical challenges and barriers to hiring and tackling the myths and misconceptions of fair chance hiring. This is going to be a really great session, lots of information. The format for our session will be as follows. Our presenter will go through her presentation. Throughout her presentation, you could submit your questions through the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen, and we'll likely address all of the questions at the end of the presentation. So at this time, it's my pleasure to turn things over to Eileen.
Thank you so much for that. That's great. And yeah, happy to be here with you all today. I'm going to share my screen. Let me see if we can get that going. Hopefully that's up and visible now. And I should give a little bit of an overview. I put a lot of stuff into the presentation, so it's going to be a lot of information in a very short window of time. But I do just want to say, if this is like a lot, I know it's a lot, so no worries on that front. But also B, we have a website with all of these tools and resources that I'm walking through, or versions of them available online. So if there's anything that I'm walking through that you're more interested in learning more about, or if you're like, oh, that was too fast, I want to hear some more about it, let me know. There's lots more content where this came from. But we're going to try and squeeze a lot into a little bit of time and talk about fair chance hiring, what that actually means, what the population of folks who have criminal records looks like. And then we'll talk a little bit about record checking at your organization if you're already doing it, what that can look like, different policy adjustments, and sort of the different sort of legal frameworks that go around record checking and things that you can be mindful of as you're doing that if it's something that you engage in as part of your hiring process. So let's get started. Lulu already mentioned the stat, and I think it's such an important one to share to really sort of set the context around the population that we're talking about, who folks with criminal records are and who the job seekers are with criminal records. It's about 1 in 9 Canadians, so it's about 4 million Canadians, about 1 million people in Ontario who have a criminal record. It's not an insignificant part of the population. It's almost 10% of Canada. So when we think about that and think about the sort of exclusion of almost 10% of the Canadian workforce from the workforce, it's something to keep in mind as we're sort of processing things like labor shortages and different things and gaps and being able to find folks to work. So I share that. And what does employment searching or job seeking look like for this population? Well, it's not always an easy thing. It's a very hard barrier, and it's a very unique barrier. That's not something that you can train away or educate away. What we've seen in our research, and these are some stats from research that we conducted in 2024. Looking at different sort of hiring managers' opinions and different sort of employers' opinions on record checking. We surveyed 400 Canadian hiring managers, and you can see the stats on the slide there. Almost 3/4 have never knowingly hired someone with a criminal record. Over half, so 60%, believe a record check should be required for all applicants. And 42% of them automatically exclude candidates based on a past record of any kind. So that means someone who has a low-level cannabis charge all the way up to a first-degree murder charge, all treated the same, right? They're all automatically excluded from that hiring pool for 42% of these 400 hiring managers. So that's not a sort of great picture for someone who's a job seeker and looking to sort of put their past behind them and re-enter the workforce and re-engage with employment. And we also know that these impacts aren't felt equally, right? They're disproportionately impacting certain populations, Black and Indigenous folks in particular. Black people are more than 3 times, or are represented by more than 3 times their percent of the Canadian population in the Canadian justice system. So we see 3 times the amount of Black people in the system than there are in the general Canadian population. Same thing with Indigenous people, by more than 5 times their share of the population. And I like to show this study. This is not one that we did out of John Howard, Ontario, but it is a really crucial and important one. And I think it really kind of speaks to the discrimination that occurs and the layers of discrimination that occur. This study was done in 2017 in Toronto, and it was looking at callback rates between white and Black applicants with and without a criminal record. So you can see a white applicant without a criminal record had about a 30% callback rate in the city. When submitting their applications. A white applicant with a criminal record drops down a little bit, goes down to about 19%. And then you have a Black applicant without a criminal record applying for a job, and you're getting close to 11%. So already we know a white applicant with a criminal record gets more callbacks than a Black applicant without a criminal record. If you compound the fact that a Black applicant has a criminal record, you can see their odds drop down to close to 1%. Right? So it shows that drastic decline and the way that these things compound and the layers and sort of intersections between different barriers folks are facing. So all of that context kind of brings us around to fair chance hiring. And that's what we're trying to do, is create a movement for fair chance hiring in Canada. It's not the first of its kind in the world. There are movements that are very similar in the United States and in the UK, but there is the first of its kind in Canada. And so we're really trying to take that context into consideration, take those barriers that folks with criminal records are facing into consideration, and really try to propel a movement to have employers join in on fairly assessing job candidates with criminal records. So let's talk about what fair chance hiring is. I'll give you sort of the Oxford blanket definition that we use, which is just that it is policies, best practices, training that any employer can use to fairly assess candidates with a criminal record. Obviously, that definition is very broad. So when we talk about fair chance hiring, I feel like it is easiest to start with what it's not, and then we can talk about what it is. So It is not affirmative action by any sense. We're not saying you need to hire X amount of folks with criminal records by the end of this year to be a fair chance employer. It's not about doing away with criminal record checks. We're not saying you should get rid of that in your hiring process. We're not saying that you shouldn't use them in certain circumstances. Us at John Howard, we use them to hire some employees. We're required to do so. So I'm not trying to preach anything like that. And we're also not trying to say it's about doing away with risk management. We do understand that this is something that employers use as part of their liability and risk management assessments. And so we're not trying to do away with that in any way. What we are trying to do, and what fair chance hiring really is about at the end of the day, is a few sort of simple things. It can be as easy as starting with some education and training. So what we're doing today is already a big step in that direction, right? Doing education and training, that myth busting that Lulu spoke about at the beginning, right? Trying to tease out some of the sort of misconceptions and stereotypes we have in our minds around the population of folks with criminal records, right? Understanding that most folks who have criminal records do not have criminal records for violent offenses, right? The majority are not folks who have served time in federal correctional institutions for these sort of large scale charges that we hear about on the news, right? Those are the ones that get a lot of airtime on the news, but that's not the average for the population, right? For the most part, low-level violent crimes, often non-violent crimes, often crimes of necessity based on marginalization, poverty, things of that nature, right? So it's really about educating and doing training on what this population looks like and how they can actually be a great asset to your organization and sort of the benefits of fair chance hiring, which is what we're talking about today. Another thing that this can involve is being open and transparent in your job ads. So just saying in a job ad, if you're going to do a record check, putting that in the job ad, but saying if it's not going to be an excluding factor, or if you're still willing to hire folks who have criminal records, even though you will be conducting a record check, just putting that in the job ad. Because what we know is that so many folks who have criminal records will self-select out of processes because they see that line that says, oh, this employer will be conducting a record check, and they just assume at the gate that they won't have any chance of getting that job, so they won't apply. So you're already excluding so many people who may be potentially looking to apply for a job with your organization. But what we've seen is that just by adding that one little line of like, yep, we're going to do a record check, but it's not necessarily going to be a disqualifying factor and you could still get this job. Having that in there will already increase the amount of applicants that you will get for that job, folks who have criminal records, because they won't be doing that self-selection. And the last piece to this, which is such a crucial piece, is making individual assessments. So what we really want to do is not say no record checks or no risk management. It's just about being a little bit more intentional and moving away from those blanket policies. That 42% of employers that I was talking about at the beginning that just automatically exclude, we want to move away from that and try to move towards more intentional hiring. So looking at the position you're hiring for, and then seeing which charges might be relevant to that position or not relevant to that position, right? And making those determinations ahead of time. So I'll give you a couple examples. If you're hiring someone to be a school bus driver, if that person has a DUI on their record, that's something that might be relevant to you, right? If they're driving a bus. But if they spray painted a wall a couple of years ago, probably a little less relevant, right? Or if you're hiring someone to be a bank teller, a fraud charge might be super relevant to you in that circumstance. But if they have a low-level cannabis charge from 10 years ago, probably a little less relevant, right? So just making those distinctions and not treating the population of folks with criminal records as a monolith, right? As this uniform group, and looking at them as though they all have these sort of very serious charges. There are also folks who have serious charges, and we can talk about that too. And it's not in the presentation. But equally deserving of finding work and sort of finding the right position for them too. But it's just about, again, the intentionality behind it and taking a look at those positions and figuring out what is actually required for the position, what are the job requirements, and which charges might be most relevant in that particular situation. The other thing that we know is that Canadians are super supportive of this. So it's not even that I'm preaching it as like the right thing to do. It's also something that has been proven to be good for business. We know that 80% of Canadians strongly believe in second chances. They strongly believe that folks should be able to go back to work again after they've served their time. And we also know that they're willing to put their money where their mouth is. So we know that 58% of them, close to 60%, are looking to buy products or services from companies that actually engage in hiring folks with criminal records. And it's not shown on the slide, but this polling that we did it back in 2020. And we sort of divided it up by age category within each sort of question that was asked. And what we know is that 50% actually increases dramatically when we're talking to the millennial population. They are even more interested in employers whose values match their own, and who are sort of conducting business in a way that matches the sort of feelings that they have towards society and to reintegration. And so we see that number goes up. They're even more likely to buy products or purchase services from employers who are hiring folks with criminal records. The other thing that we know, and I mentioned this at the top, we're not the first to do this, right? It has existed in the US and in the UK, and they're actually much further ahead than we are. So that's a great benefit to us because we actually have research from employers in the States who have had cohorts of employees with criminal records working for them for 5 to 10 years, right? So they have these like longitudinal studies where we can see the on the ground business impacts, what this looks like in terms of dollars and cents for an employer to hire folks. And so we're very fortunate to be able to sort of see that example. And so what we do know, and this is sort of a huge one that we like to point to, and Lulu mentioned it up top about the loyalty of the population. They do have a much lower turnover rate than your average employee. I think right now, HR Reporter reported that about 1 in 3 employees are actively looking for another job while they're at their current employer. So if you take that and contrast that with the fact that folks with criminal records have a 13% lower turnover rate, that's huge, especially for employers, again, who are thinking long-term about the efficiency of their organization, and really maintaining a certain quality of service, product, whatever that they might be doing. That lower turnover rate is huge. And it's a thing because of the loyalty that this population will show to an employer that gives them a fair chance, right? You can imagine after going through a job seeking process as someone with a criminal record and constantly being told no and having so many doors closed on you. When you do have an employer open a door, when you do have an employer that says yes and hires you, how loyal you would be willing to be to that employer because of the fact that they offered you this job. And so that's what we really see with this population is it's a highly loyal population. We also know that their quality of work is the same, if not higher. So very hardworking. Again, to Lulu's point up top, we talked about this. It is, again, to the fact that there are very few opportunities afforded to this population. So they are more keen to be hard workers. They are more keen to demonstrate their skill and to prove themselves in a workforce. So we actually see that the quality of talent is the same, if not higher. And the cost of hiring individuals with criminal records is the same, if not lower. So all of the sort of typical hiring manager costs, onboarding costs, things like that, the same, if not lower. So those are just some of the business case behind why this is actually a great idea for organizations and why this is something that you can add to your DE&I initiatives that you're already focusing on and building out that group of folks that you're trying to be inclusive of. And so that's really what the coalition is all about. That's why we created the coalition. It really exists to sort of propel this movement, and we're working with employers to do that. And we're super happy to work with any employers that are looking to join. It is not a one-size-fits-all approach. Every employer is a little bit different, how they hire, their different policies, the sort of structure of their organizations. They all look a little bit different. So we don't try to use a one-size-fits-all approach. We really work individually with employers to make sure that this can be incorporated into your organization in a way that makes sense to you, right? So it's not about hiring a certain amount of people or doing certain things, changing language in your policy. That may not make sense for every employer. So like I said, we do try to tailor it to the individual employer, and I'm happy to chat through any of that with anyone if it's something that's of interest. Well, let's get into the sort of second half of this presentation, which is really looking at the legal sphere that operates around record checking and things that you should be mindful of as an employer when you're doing record checks, and what this can look like with some of those fair chance principles implemented in between and sort of incorporated. So It's hard to have this conversation without talking about laws and legislation, which I know is always a little bit boring, but I promise I will be quick and try to make it fun. So the law that governs record checks in Ontario is the Police Record Checks Reform Act. This is what governs how employers can get record checks. It also governs how police services disclose information. This act came into force in 2018. And what we saw in 2018 when it came into force is that it standardized how record checks happened across the province. So before, it was sort of very piecemeal. Different police forces were doing things in different ways, releasing different kinds of information. And now what we have is a standardized system for the most part that has 3 different levels of checks that are available to employers to choose from that they can conduct for potential employees. And within that act too, there are certain discretionary pieces where police forces can sort of still include or exclude certain pieces of information, but for the most part, it is a very standardized process. So who does it apply to? So it applies to anyone who's trying to search the CPIC database, so the Canadian Police Information Center, and anyone who's searching any other police database for individual screening purposes. So that could be me going to a police service and saying, hey, I want a record check on myself, but it could also be you as an employer going and doing the same thing, saying, hey, I'm looking to get a record check on this individual for employment, volunteering, if they're applying for some type of license to hold a certain office, membership. Some school programs, some educational institutions also require it. So that's who the act applies to. Who it doesn't apply to and what it doesn't apply to is a little bit, is a little confusing because there's some things that are exempt from the entire act and there's some stuff that's exempt from only parts of the act. I won't sort of get into this too much because I doubt it'll apply to too many people. Youth records are, of course, exempt from the act. That is something that a typical employer would not be able to see, minus government employers are basically like the only ones, different government institutions and certain actors. But for the most part, youth records are sealed and not something you will ever have access to as an employer. And any searches for child custody arrangements, firearms, name changes, things like that. These are exempt from the act. They fall under different pieces of legislation. So there are different laws that govern those things. And then again, like I said, there are certain parts of the act that don't apply to some specific things. So non-disclosure requirements for schools and childcare providers. This is basically just there are certain institutions that could apply for record check results and receive a little bit more information in certain circumstances because of the type of business that they operate. So schools and childcare providers, of course, securities markets, and then just any agency that already has access to the CPIC database, they'll be able to see that if they're already being provided access to it. So let's talk about the types of checks. So I'm gonna do them in order. So we just go level 1 to 3, and that is just from the least intrusive type of check to the most intrusive type of check. And what I mean by that is just the least amount of information that's shared to the most amount of information that's shared. So this is obviously very personal information to a human being. And so something to be mindful of as you're sort of combing through record check results and what those can look like. You're receiving a lot of very static, so at a moment in time, and also very personal information about an individual. So let's talk about those types of checks. The first level, which many of you might be familiar with, because this is one that's often used in the employment setting, it's the criminal record check. It's a very sort of basic level check. It's something that will provide you sort of very baseline information. So any criminal convictions that haven't been pardoned or suspended or subject to a record suspension, any summary convictions for the past 5 years. So summary convictions after a certain amount of time will no longer be visible on a record check. It's because summary convictions are often lesser type offenses. So your theft under 5,000, trespassing, things like that. After 5 years of time elapsing, they won't show up on the record check anymore, but for those first 5 years, you will be able to see them. And then in some cases, findings of guilt under the Youth Criminal Justice Act. Again, this is not something that's typically passed on to most employers. It's very, very in very specific circumstances. And if it is passed along to employers, it will be on a separate record and not disclosed as the main, sort of adult record. The second type of check just adds in judicial matters. So you still get that criminal record check, but now you're also getting all these additional judicial matters. You're going up in level of intrusivity, of course, because this one is something that you'll be able to see outstanding criminal charges, so things that folks have not been found guilty of, and any sort of outstanding arrest warrants, right? So things that have not actually come to fruition in the criminal justice system. There's been no determination of guilt or anything associated to them, but you will be able to see them. And of course, criminal records are not something that are protected under the Human Rights Code. So it's something that employers can and do discriminate against. So having that additional information is something that can be used to discriminate against a job seeker. Not outstanding criminal offenses that have been subject to discharge, either conditional or absolute discharges. And just for context, for those who don't know, conditional and absolute discharges are sort of the lowest level of sentencing that you can get, minus charges obviously being entirely withdrawn. But they are the lowest level, and it essentially is just either these charges will be withdrawn absolutely within a certain amount of time, or with once certain conditions are met. So you'd still be able to see those even though that person may have completed all of their conditions. It is used by some employers. I'm seeing it more frequently being used by more employers. So we do see that level of intrusivity kind of going up there, but that's what a level 2 record check will get you. Level 3, which many folks are familiar with because you're familiar with it if it applies to you. You're sort of deeply familiar with it if you're an employer that works with vulnerable people. Something that is required by law for you to conduct a vulnerable sector check if you are a company or an organization that works with vulnerable people. It is the most in-depth criminal background check. It provides the most amount of information of all 3 levels. And of course, it's used most frequently in cases where you're hiring someone who's going to be working with a vulnerable population of some kind. So it'll give you everything those other 2 checks provided, but it will also give you information about convictions that have been suspended, or folks who've had record suspensions for certain convictions. It will give you that information, even though they may have had their record sealed and pardoned. It will also give you access to information around criminal offenses where the person has been found not criminally responsible on account of a mental disorder, unless they received an absolute discharge. Again, so a lot of this is like accept. There's lots of exemptions on these things, but this is a sort of a general picture of what you'll get. And then some non-conviction information. This particularly applies to sexual offenses involving children or a vulnerable person. You'll be able to get some non-conviction information, which is a little bit more details. Because on a record check, which I'll show you in a little bit, on a record check, you get sort of very basic information. You'll just get like dates, names, a charge, a sentence, and it won't provide you a lot of details or context around the situation. But in this case, you would get access to some of that non-conviction information in those particular cases. I want to stick on the vulnerable sector check for just a second, just because it is such an intense level of check, and there are many more sort of components that go into asking for this check. And this is sort of a big one. If you're an organization that's running this kind of check, or you're thinking about running this kind of check, you do have to meet all 4 of these conditions to run it. And without meeting all 4 of these conditions, you cannot ask for a vulnerable sector check. So 1, the request has to be made by a person or organization responsible for the well-being of a child or a vulnerable person. The request has to be made in the context of a specific application. So whether it's paid or volunteering, that means that I cannot go to a police service and say, hey, I want a vulnerable sector check on myself. It has to be in the context of a position of some kind. And then the third one is that the position has to be one where that person is going to be in a position of trust or authority over a vulnerable person. So if you work as a childcare provider and you hire cleaners to come in at night when no one else is there, you would meet the first 2 conditions, but you wouldn't meet the third, right? If they're not interacting with any children, you technically should not be asking for a vulnerable sector check for that person. And then of course, the last one is that that applicant has to give their consent in writing. So they have to actually agree to having it. And the thing with the vulnerable sector check, so the first 2 levels of check will go directly to the employer. A vulnerable sector check goes directly to the individual, and then they can choose to share it with that employer afterwards. But it does have to be in the context of that application. And I did just throw up the definition here of a vulnerable person, just to sort of really clarify that third point of what we're talking about in terms of position of trust. So it's a person who, because of their age, disability, or other circumstances, whether temporary or permanent, is in a position of dependency on others, or is at a greater risk of being harmed by a person in a position of trust or authority. So again, of course, if you have staff at a childcare sort of facility, at a nursing home, anything like that, who's interacting with folks, absolutely, that is a position of trust or authority. That is something that would require a vulnerable sector check. I do just want to touch on some offenses under the Act, because there are things to be mindful of as an employer, and then there's also things that you should be mindful of from the police service side in terms of things that you could potentially get caught in. So there are actually offenses under the Act for employers who don't apply the Act appropriately. So you could actually, as an employer, be guilty of an offense if you fail to request the check in a manner required by the Act, or if you do it without the individual's consent. So for example, if you're not meeting all the conditions for a vulnerable sector check, but you're asking for one, that is technically an offense under the Act. Or if you're conducting the check without getting authorization from the individual who you're doing the criminal record check on, also an offense under the Act. The second part applies mostly to police services, as they're the ones who are often responding to requests for a record check. But they will be guilty of an offense if they disclose unauthorized information, if they violate any disclosure requirements, if they provide a youth record as part of the same record. So if they're not actually separating out the youth record, that is a violation of the Act. If they disclose information to other parties that have not been consented to by the individual, and if they disclose information for some other unauthorized purpose. So things to keep in mind as you're receiving information from police services as well, right? Like if that's something you might want to flag to them if they're oversharing or over providing information and maybe unaware. Okay, so let's talk about whether employers are required to request a criminal record check under the law. So when we think about the different types of legislation that governs criminal record checks, it is that PRCRA that I was talking about. But are there any other laws that require you to do a record check? The answer is no, except for vulnerable sector, right? So again, only in certain circumstances, if someone's working in a retirement home, long-term care home, child care center, working for anyone who provides services and supports to persons with developmental disabilities, or anyone working at a school or a school board. So those are the only times when the law requires and demands an employer conduct a record check. Anything outside of that is just something that an employer is choosing to do on their own. But other than that, that is the only time that it is legally required of an employer. And I threw this note at the end here about the Occupational Health and Safety Act. It does not require any employers to conduct criminal background checks on any of their employees. And I'll show you why I put that note at the end here when I get to my next slide, which is that we've actually done research asking employers why they conduct record checks. And you can see here that Bill 168, which is an amendment to the Occupational Health and Safety Act, a little over 20% of employers say that is the reason they conduct record checks. But there's nothing that in that act that requires an employer to do a record check, nor is it demanded of the act. So it has nothing to do with workplace health and safety, and the act does not require it. But we do see a lot of employers using Bill 168 as they say that's the reason that they're conducting that check. Of course, liability and risk management is also up there. Company policy is up there. Legal requirements for vulnerable sector checks, that one we've covered, of course, makes sense. We know that that's a thing. Funding requirements, this is something that our local John Howards are subject to, we're subject to. There are certain government contracts, funding agreements that come in and require you to record check for the staff that you're hiring for certain positions. So you can't really sidestep some of those things. Insurance requirements, we're seeing this one a lot more than we used to. We have some insurance companies that are asking for it as part of the risk management strategy. And then 5% that said other. But let's talk about what record checking actually gets you, and what sort of obligations and limitations are on an employer who is conducting record checks. I talked about the middle one a little bit already about human rights obligations. There are no human rights protections for someone who has a criminal record that hasn't been pardoned or suspended. There are protections for folks who have received record suspensions, but other than that, it really is sort of fair game, and so it doesn't prohibit discrimination the way it does, based on race or disability or gender or age or anything like that. So it is something that is very much a live consideration, that there are no sort of legal protections for folks who have criminal records. Negligent hiring is another one that comes up with employers that we talk through. Employers who may be concerned that if they hire someone with a criminal record and something happens in the workplace, that they could be charged either by other employees or by someone accessing their services. There is no such thing as negligent hiring for someone with a criminal record in Canada. We've not seen a single case, at least to my knowledge, and I usually check in every few months. So this has not come up. It is something that has happened in the States, but the States are sort of a highly litigious country. They like to sue people for a lot of things. And so we've seen it there, but it is not something that has ever happened in Canada. So we've never seen an employer being held liable for not running a record check on someone. And the last thing is unionized workplaces. I just throw this in because it is something that does impact certain organizations, certain companies, certain workplaces. There might be union labor agreements that limit who you hire or how you hire. And so I flagged that because I also know that that's something that, that to be mindful of. And so you may be conducting record checks based on that union agreement or limited by that union agreement in the same way. And I want to touch on the sort of risk management liability piece, right? We saw, I'm just going to go back a few slides. We saw here in the chart that over, a quarter of folks use record checks for liability and risk management. So it's 28%. But what we've actually seen in our research is that record checks are not a good predictor of future behavior or how someone's going to behave in the workplace. There's very little, if any, social science evidence that links someone's criminal record to their activity in the workplace and whether they're going to be a danger or harm to anyone in the workplace or if they're going to be a good employee. And so we actually don't have that link there. And so what we say is a record check is something that's providing a false sense of security based on a piece of static information about an individual's past. And so if you're holding them to that moment in their past, you're not getting a really full picture of who they are as an employee or what that person is capable of as part of your workforce. Okay, so what does this look like now in the context of fair chance hiring and fair chance hiring principles? I do just want to briefly touch on that too. So how can you keep all of this information in mind and then also integrate fair chance hiring? And I did say up top that there's really no specific on-road for everyone. How this looks for every organization is going to be a little bit different. We give some suggestions and some thoughts here, but of course, like this is very much something that needs to be tailored to the organization and how they operate. If you have, some organizations have like internal legal capacity, some have HR's professionals working for them, some don't. Some of them are more small businesses, medium-sized businesses, and they sort of do all of these things, wear all these hats at the same time. So how this looks for all those different employers is going to be very different. And so we are mindful of that, but I want to give a few thoughts, a few suggestions, and we can talk through them and walk through them in terms of how we implement fair chance hiring as part of this larger structure of how you're conducting record checks in your business. The first is identifying all the positions ahead of time that require a record check. So just going through the list of jobs in your organization and saying, who do I actually need to record check for? What will a record check give me that I need to know for this position? So is it something that I need for all positions across the organization? Is it something that I only need for my finance manager or my HR manager? Or is it something that I only need for someone who's doing direct service delivery with children or you know, anyone working in an old age home or something like that. So being mindful of which positions actually need that record check and figuring that out ahead of time and making that evaluation. Once you've figured out which positions require, and if you're like all of them, that's also an answer, that's fine too, but then making individual assessments based on those positions. So what is the relevance of any specific charge to the position being applied for? The same as that school bus driver. So if you're hiring for someone to drive a bus, you would want to know any sort of driving incident that is very relevant to the position being applied for, right? Any sort of lower level charges like trespassing, theft under 5,000, probably a little less relevant, right? So you can maybe exclude those. And I flagged this here because I know some folks work with third-party record check companies who actually conduct the record checks on their behalf. And if that's the case, you can actually have these conversations with your record check company to say, like, these are the offenses that I want to flag, and these are the ones that I, you know, am sort of less concerned about. And so when they give you the record check results, they can fit within those parameters and follow whatever lead you give them there. The next piece is, and we talked about this earlier on about the self-selection. If your policy is to not automatically exclude someone with a record, just stating that in your job position goes a long, long way. Just being vocal about the fact that you're not automatically excluding job candidates goes a long, long way for the candidates themselves, but also for folks who are helping them search for jobs, right? Being able to know that this is a place that they can apply to and work at potentially, obviously assuming that they meet all the other qualifications of the job. You can put that in the position and actually grow the amount of folks who are applying for your job in a very sort of, there's a very small way to do it, and it goes a really long way. Having in place a plan or a process to determine what to do if a positive check is returned by the applicant. So if it's not an automatic exclusion, having a process in place. Are you going to have a follow-up conversation with them to get a little bit more information about the circumstances behind the charge, right? Maybe it's something that you see a really scary word on a record check. You see like the word assault, for example, and you're like, oh, or you see assault with a weapon and you think to yourself, oh, you're like imagining a gun or a machete or something very violent. You know, we've seen clients who have had assault with a weapon charged for throwing a piece of paper or a cell phone. So having that context really changes how you're approaching the situation. So having a plan in place to actually talk through those things with the candidate can be huge, right? And just, again, give you a little bit more information than just those words that are coming in on a piece of paper that don't really tell you that much about the job applicant. Determining who's going to review the results and who will have access to these. This is just a personal sort of privacy information sharing piece that we like to have folks keep in mind. Is just about you know, protecting an individual's privacy, especially if they're in a workplace with lots of other folks. Who actually needs to know about their criminal record, right? Who needs to be aware of it? Who does it impact, right? Not obviously sharing that information organization wide, as that can have a lot of ramifications for the individual applicant, right? Unless it's necessary. So only sharing it with folks where necessary, having a process in place for how you store those results. And then delaying asking for a record check until a conditional offer has been made. So going through all the other steps of your hiring process, your interviews, your resume, sort of reading, things like that, any sort of other requirements that you have, and then only doing that at the end of a hiring process as opposed to up top. So you're asking less people to go through this record check for, you know, only if they're actually in the running for a job. The last thing I'm going to touch on, and this is an awful screenshot because you can't really see it, but this is available on our website. And I would really encourage you to go check it out if you're interested in learning a little bit more about how to read a record check. This is just an example of the type of information you will see on a record check when it comes in. And this is what I mean by having so little information about an individual. You'll get their name, you'll get maybe a date, you'll get the date and time of when the whatever happened took place. You'll see the charge, and again, you'll see words that might be a little bit scary without context. So you'll see something like assault or breach of a court order, things like that, unlawful assembly, right? And then you'll have the disposition, which is just essentially how, if there's any sentence or anything attached to it, you'll be able to see that. But it really doesn't give you all that much information about an individual. And like I said, it's a very sort of static piece of information about a person. So it doesn't actually tell you much about their life or who they are, or what they can do or what they're capable of in a workplace. And this is a lot longer and a lot more complex, but I am also aware that I'm sort of 45 minutes in and I want to leave time for questions if anyone has any. So I would certainly encourage you to go take a look at this resource in a little bit more depth if it's something that you're particularly interested in. We have lots more resources on our website. As I mentioned, if there's anything in this deck, I know I was kind of blowing through a lot of stuff and it's a lot of information and a lot of content. But if there's anything that is of particular interest, our Fair Chances website has all of this content for employers. It's just www.fairchances.ca. You can go check it out. And there's a whole section for employers with all kinds of resources and tools and information around fair chance hiring. And like I said, we're also happy to work with folks one-on-one to sort of figure out how this looks for them. So that's it for me. I do want to sort of leave time if there are any questions or thoughts. I'm also happy to just take any sort of, if people, I know it's a topic that can sometimes generate a lot of conversation and thought around how it could apply. So happy to just hear folks out too on that front.
Great. Thank you so much. That was a great presentation. Lots of great insight. So 13% lower turnover rate. Quality of work is high. Cost of hiring is the same, if not lower. So that really struck me. I'm just wondering, are there any sectors that have been maybe more active in hiring individuals with a criminal record than others? Are you seeing any trends?
Yes, absolutely. I think a lot in construction and trades, they often don't record check. So that's often where folks are funneled because they're like, oh, well, you don't need to have a record check, so we can just send you here. Retail too is another one. It's not always that we'll see record checks in the retail sector, so there is some room there. But what I would say is, record check or not, we're really trying to work towards meaningful opportunities for folks. So if someone's not interested in construction or trades, you don't want to funnel them there just because they have a criminal record, right? It's really, folks like Lulu who are working on the front line and working with folks and talking to them about what their interests are and really trying to line that up with the job that's going to make them the most fulfilled, right? And that they're going to want to bring the most to. That's also a huge piece of this. So there are some sectors that are less likely to record check or more likely to hire someone with a criminal record. But we really just want to open up the doors to a lot more places and a lot more people.
Makes sense. Is the process the same for those looking for volunteer positions? Because a lot of times you're told, you should volunteer, get your name out there. It could lead to employment opportunities. Is it the same type of process?
Pretty much. If you're sort of subject to that act that I was talking about, it applies to positions that are paid or unpaid. So if you fall under any of the parameters, like an employer could record check you as part of that hiring process, even if it's just for a volunteer opportunity. It really depends on the employer and how they hire. But yeah, absolutely.
That's great. We do have a question. If you have something that would be on your record, should you disclose that at the beginning of the hiring process or wait until they see it on your record to ask? That's a great question.
This is a really sort of personal question to the individual. I think it really depends on their comfort level about talking about their criminal record. I've seen it both ways, and there are pros and cons to both sides of it. Disclosing it ahead of time can really help you build trust with an employer, and also it gives you an opportunity to sort of discuss any circumstances around that you might want to explain. And it also offers you that opportunity to say, well, I did have that happen, but here are also some things that I've been doing since. Here's how I've changed my life, right? So it really kind of lets you triage it and get to it with an employer out the gate. Waiting and seeing if it comes up is always a risk you take. Some folks are not comfortable having those conversations. So it really is sort of a personal thing to them. I've seen it, like, again, you could try to follow up with the employer after they see and see if it's something that you could have a conversation about. But I also and we talk to clients about this too, and just the age of internet and social media, there's a lot of stuff that is available publicly, that's very easy to find out without actually running any of these record checks, right? Like there are news articles and things like that that could be available that you get way more information than you were ever looking for. And so I think, if you're working with clients and doing that side of things, having those conversations with them up top and warning them about those things and yeah, disclosing it ahead of time can be a huge pro, but of course you also could ruin your chances of getting that job by providing that disclosure.
Yeah, a tough call for sure. I
Mhm.
don't see any other questions in the chat. This was a great conversation. I really appreciate you taking the time to share your knowledge with us. Again, some very valuable insight that we can all use. So thank you so much. Thank you to everybody who's joined us. Our next session, our next Lunch and Learn takes place on April 22nd, and the topic will focus on available grants and business resources. So another great session for sure. Hope you can join us on the 22nd. Everybody, thanks so much for joining us. Have yourselves a great afternoon. Take care, everyone.
Thanks so much.